Greetings, everyone. Laszlo Montgomery here with another nice vintage episode from Days Gone By. Sorry about the gap in the action. I know this one's a little late. Hope you don't mind too much. Thanks for listening to the China Vintage Hour. We're back with more Sven Hedin. It's the year 1895, 20 years into the sad and frustrating reign of the Guangxu Emperor. While Sven Hedin is busy exploring the unknown areas in and around southwest Xinjiang, on the other side of the country, China is being picked apart and divided up amongst the great foreign powers of the day that now included Japan. 1895, always a year in Chinese history that lives in infamy. But way, way out west, you'd hardly know what was going on in Beijing. It was a whole different world out there. Xinjiang, or Chinese Turkestan as it was referred to, was a huge expanse of territory, for the most part, still unexplored. The Silk Roads that had been passing through these parts since the early Han Dynasty always stuck to the well-worn beaten paths. Beyond the roads traversed by thousands and thousands of caravans were regions where no man had yet gone. Certainly no European man, I should say, or woman yet. And Sven Hedin was jonesing to have a go at uncovering some of the mysteries that lay between Kashgar in the west of Xinjiang, all the way to the Khotan River, 500 miles to the east. Today that's maybe an 8-hour drive on the G315 highway. Back in Sven's time, 1895, the only way to traverse that distance was on the back of a camel. We're going to read some more passages from Volume 1 of his book, Through Asia. And this time we'll hear about Sven's ill-fated trip across the Taklamakan Desert. Not a terribly hospitable place, but people have been living there since prehistoric times. The desert was rimmed by natural obstacles. The Tian Shan mountain range was to the north, the Gobi Desert to the east, the Pamir Mountains to the north and west, and the Kunlun Mountains to the south. The total area of this desert is about 130,000 square miles, bigger than the whole state of New Mexico, to give you an idea. Back in the day, China used to test their nuclear bombs in the Tarim Basin at Lop Nur. So remote and desolate was the Taklamakan Desert. The Silk Roads skirted the northern and southern rims of the desert, and a number of familiar oasis towns had popped up along the route, like Kashgar, Khotan, Yarkand, Turpan, and Dunhuang, to name a few. In this episode, we're going to follow Sven Hedin as he prepares to cross a stretch of this desert. I wasn't sure if I was going to read this passage because it's rather gruesome. Well, not the portion being presented today, but probably next episode. Right now, we'll get about a week into his journey before we hit the end of stoppage time. So we'll get a bit more than a quarter of the way into this ill-fated expedition. There are a whole slew of place names and various Uyghur, Kyrgyz, and Kazakh terms used here and there, like Arbaz is a kind of a cart drawn by bullocks. And the term Daria, you'll hear a lot. It means river. The Khotan Daria, the Yarkand River, which runs north and south across the westernmost part of Xinjiang and the Taklamakan Desert. You'll also hear about the Dolan people, the Daolang or Dorlang people. They're an ancient people who over the centuries got assimilated in with the Uyghurs, Kyrgyz, and Kazakhs. They have a unique culture that differentiates them a little. In any case, don't look for them on the list of ethnic groups in China. They're not on it. But the Dolans are in our story today, so just wanted to make you aware of them. A beg, it's a sort of a village headman or elder, the guy in charge. And you'll hear the term tenge. It was a unit of local currency. You'll also hear references to Mazar Tag. This is the tallest mountain in that region, and also the name of a fort and Muslim shrine. The ruins still exist. There's a lot of Uyghur words that I'm not terribly sure how to pronounce, but I'm going to give it my best try. So let's turn back the pages of time to 1895, 122 years ago from this 2017 vantage point. Not ancient history, but Compared to us in our age of technological wonders and conveniences, it sure seems like it. You know, even today, with all the gadgets and whatnot that we have at our disposal, crossing the Taklamakan Desert by camel is a risky and dangerous thing to do. I mean, you have the G314 highway that runs through part of it, but trying to cross it was always a challenge, and still is today, if you try it Sven Hedin style. As we open chapter 38, it's March 1895, and Sven's as frustrated as hell about how long it's taken to get his expedition on the road. Every day delay brings him one day closer to summer, not high season for crossing the Taklamakan, or any desert. He's trying to secure camels, and it's taken forever. In April, he'll set out from the relative safety and comfort of Kashgar for the Khotan River. I hope you enjoy this story. On the threshold of the desert, March 15th. This day marked the beginning of a long period of waiting, extremely trying to my patience. Day after day went by, but no camels arrived. I would gladly pass over these 25 days altogether, but find in my notebook certain incidents and facts that are not without interest. I made it my business to gather all the information I could about the desert that stretched to the east. For instance, today, I heard of two men who, a few years ago, started from the village of Yantak, on the right bank of the Khotan Daria, taking with them provisions for 12 days. After 3 days, they reached a disused riverbed, deep and stony, with a wooden bridge across it, but so dilapidated that it would not bear them to walk on it. They thought at first of following up the course of the river, but as they found no water in that direction, they retraced their steps and went downstream, and there discovered quantities of nephrite, or jade. After another 7 days, they reached the mountain of Mazar-Tag, where they found Kamish and obtained water by digging. Today, Islam Bai returned from Yarkand, bringing with him 4 iron tanks for water, 6 goatskins, sesame oil, and seed husks for the camels, petroleum, bread, toasted flour, macaroni, honey sacks, spades, whips, bridle bits, bowls, cups, and other requisites. On March 19th, we moved over to the large village of Merette on the right bank of the Khotan Daria, whence the caravan was to make its start for the desert. In the morning, a number of the inhabitants of Merette came to escort us to their village. The Beg, Mohammed Niaz Beg, arrived with a present of chickens, eggs, and light refreshments. He was a tall man with a thin white beard and looked energetic and severe. Transport horses were employed to carry over our baggage, and after the Anbashi of Lilac and his pretty wife, who had both been very kind and hospitable during my stay in their house, had been well rewarded with money and cloth, we marched down to the ferry, which conveyed us and our large caravan across in 4 trips. The ice had evidently ceased to melt farther to the south, for the river had fallen 11 inches since March 8th, and from this time onwards it would continue to sink until the summer floods came down from the mountains. After a quarter of an hour's ride in a southeasterly direction, we passed the village of Angetlik. At the end of an hour, we reached the village of Chamgerluk, and after another 3/4 of an hour, were in Merette. The Beg placed his own house at my disposal, and I was soon installed in a large and pleasant room covered with carpets and with niches in the walls. Strange to say, Merette has never been visited by any European. One man told me that, along with some companions, he had traveled for 20 days on foot through the desert, carrying with them supplies of food and water on donkeys. After going 7 days east-northeast by the side of gigantic sand dunes, they reached a long, straggling mountain. My informant, besides many others, was in the habit of going out every year into the desert to look for gold, but as yet had found nothing. They called the desert Taklamakan, and the general consensus of opinion was that, given strong camels, we ought to be able to cross right over it to the Khotan Daria. In the evening, I held a levee. Niaz Beg and the Anbashi of Angetlik, Togda Khodia, each presented me with a sheep, while the Hindus gave me a goodly supply of potatoes and butter, both exceedingly welcome. Afterwards, we were entertained for a long time with the music of a zither and a small harp, which played in a slow time, sounding very well altogether, although the music was rather melancholy. March 20th. Khotan was a thorough gentleman. He often came to see me and would sit talking in my room by the hour together. When I began to grow impatient at receiving no news of the camels, he always exhorted me to patience, saying with unruffled composure and with a conviction that allowed of no demur, "Kheladi, Kheladi, they will come, they will come." But nothing was heard of them, and precious time was being wasted. I felt that we were heaping glowing coals on our heads, for spring was upon us, and during the hot season of the year, the desert is simply a furnace. Meanwhile, Khotan gave me much valuable information. Today, for example, he told me the inhabitants of Merette are Dolans, and that in their own opinion, they are in no wise different from the people of Kashgar. They possess a few slight dialectical differences of speech, that is all. But Khotan himself considered them very different from their neighbors. Their natures were hard and cold, and they were so unforgiving that trifling disputes would linger on for years. The observances of Islam were jealously kept at Merette. On the last Bazaar day, in the middle of the fast, a man ate before the sun set. He was immediately seized, flogged, and with his hands tied behind his back was led in a rope through the bazaar, from every corner of which the following questions and answers were re-echoed as the offender passed. "Did you eat?" "Yes." "Did you mean to do it again?" "Never." It is also customary to blacken the culprit's face before he makes his penitential promenade through the bazaar. On March 21st, I visited the bazaar. It was very spacious, and every trade and calling had a special alley allotted to it. Nevertheless, there was no trading done except once a week, namely on the bazaar day, when stalls and wares are brought out of the houses and arranged on platforms built in front of them. At the time of my visit, there were a number of women sitting on the platform sewing. The women were always unveiled, generally bareheaded, and wore their thick black hair in 2 long plaits. A particularly popular occupation with them seemed to be the extermination of certain undesirable parasites, and it was by no means a rare thing to see one woman with her head resting in her neighbor's lap. At last, on March 22nd, Mohammed Yaqub came back from Kashgar, bringing a bulky mailbag, but no camels. I was thus left precisely where I had been at the beginning of the month. Now I fell back upon my excellent Islam Bai, and on the next day sent him off to Yarkand post-haste with peremptory orders not to come back again without camels. Happily, I had my meteorological and astronomical observations, to say nothing of the letters I had just received, and of old Khotan to help me pass the time. I did not find Johannes the missionary much of a resource. He was one of those morbidly religious people who imagine that true Christianity is incompatible with a sober joy in life, as well as with good spirits. This was no doubt partly due to his being a converted Mohammedan. Such proselytes are often 10 times worse than their teachers. However, he was good-natured and helpful, though he always seemed to be depressed and in dull spirits. March 26th. Niaz Beg administered justice at his own house every day. His usual seat was beside one of the columns which supported the roof of the veranda, and so long as the proceedings lasted, he assumed a very severe expression of countenance. On the platform by his side sat his Mirza, or secretary, who entered the proceedings in a protocol. Round about him stood his men and the officers of the law, and before him the culprit. Today there was a very curious case. A man had 5 wives. The 5th, a handsome, stalwart young woman, had run away to Kashgar with another man. The beg had given information to the authorities there, and they found the woman and sent her back to Merette, where she was now to answer for her transgressions. After she had been convicted of unfaithfulness, the beg gave her a slap on either cheek, and she began to weep. The only thing she had to say in her own defense was that life with the other 4 wives was altogether unbearable. She had a knife on her person, and when the beg asked her what she was going to do with it, she answered that she meant to kill herself if she were compelled to return to her husband. Her punishment was that, for a time, she should go and dwell with the mullahs, till she should be in a better frame of mind, and then should quietly return home to her husband. After that, another young woman was brought forward, her face bleeding and lacerated, and followed by her mother and her husband. She also had left her husband, but in this case the man had taken the law into his own hands and had cruelly kicked and mishandled her. Several witnesses confirmed the statement that he had made use of a razor. This, however, the defendant denied. To make him confess, the beg gave orders for his hands to be tied behind his back and then had him strung up to the branch of a tree. He did not hang there long before the device produced the desired effect. The man was taken down, and 40 strokes of the rod were administered on that part of the body which seems to have been providentially provided for castigation. Meanwhile, he declared that his wife had beaten him on the back. Forthwith, he was stripped, but as no marks were visible, a second whipping was the result. In these distant regions, the sense of justice is somewhat elastic. If the accused has a well-lined purse, he gets off scot-free, and in any case, the beg receives certain tenga for his trouble. If the plaintiff is not satisfied with the verdict, he can appeal to a higher authority, the nearest Chinese mandarin, and to him the beg must answer in his turn. The Chinese administration is admirable. One prudent feature in it is that they allow the natives to retain the same system of local self-government which they obtained in the time of Yaqub Beg of Kashgar. Cases of conjugal infidelity are not, on the whole, uncommon, nor are they punished with particular severity. As a rule, the woman has her face blacked, is placed backwards on a male ass, and with her hands tied behind her, is taken through the streets and bazaar of the village. Monogamy is the rule. It is very seldom that a man has 4 or 5 wives. If a woman marries a Chinaman or a European, she is considered impure, and when she dies, is not interred in the general burial ground of the place, because she had consorted with, quote, one who eats swine's flesh, so that her body would pollute the graves of the faithful. With regard to kalim, or the dower of a bride, the customs of these people are much the same as those of Kyrgyz. The kalim is paid to the bride's parents, and varies according to the man's circumstances and means. A bai, or rich man, gives as much as 9 to 10 pounds each. As a general rule, everything is paid in kind, but the bride's trousseau, or bridal gown, is compulsory kalim. A poor man offers merely a measure of food and clothes. The amount depends entirely upon the demands of the parents, but beauty and physical charms are of less importance than among the Kyrgyz. If a young couple cannot obtain the consent of their parents, it is not unusual for them to run away. They generally come back, however, after a few months and invite the old people to a feast when all misunderstandings are cleared up. On another occasion, the beg gave judgment on 2 men who had been gambling. One of them had a deep gash in his ear, and the whole of his face and chest were covered with blood. He had lost 7 tenga, 1 shilling and 6pence, and promised to procure the money in the bazaar. The winner, however, demanded his winnings on the spot, whereupon the loser drew his knife and slashed himself on the air, crying, "You shall have that instead of your money." The beg ordered the winner to be publicly whipped. The other man was to be whipped as soon as his hurt was cured. The winnings, needless to say, found their way into the beg's pocket. The start from Merette. Islam and Yaqub came back on the 8th of April. After a great deal of haggling and trouble, they had succeeded in getting at Kargalik 8 splendid male camels for a trifle over 6 pounds and 10 pence apiece. It had somehow got wind amongst the inhabitants that we absolutely must have camels for our desert journey, and in consequence they put up their prices to double or 3 times what they usually were. A further difficulty arose out of the fact that the only animals which would serve our purpose must be such as were accustomed to the level plains and to traveling in desert regions, animals which were used to moving over sand and could endure heat and other privations. These qualities were of much more consequence than the appearance of the beasts and their condition of flesh. During the morning we christened the camels and measured their girths between the humps, with the view of ascertaining how they would compare in that respect at the end of the journey. How little we foresaw that only one camel, namely Chongkara, would survive the journey. Aktuya, a handsome white camel which led the string with a big copper bell provided with a heavy iron tongue, did get to the other side of the desert, but he died soon afterwards from the fatigues of the march. Bogra was an exceptionally well-proportioned animal, patient and good-natured. I chose him to ride upon. Nar was a vicious beast, always trying to bite and kick the moment anybody went near him. Babai, the oldest in the troop and of a gray color, was the first to succumb. The other three were young, lively things. Having had a long rest, they were always ready to march, and took real pleasure in being on the move. They chanced to be just molting when they arrived. Every day, big, shaggy cuts of their thick, warm winter hair fell off, so that they had a patched, shabby appearance, so long as the process of shedding lasted. Each camel was provided with a good, soft pack saddle, stuffed with hay and straw. The animals were tethered in a large courtyard immediately opposite Niaz Beg's house, and were given their fill of good hay, a luxury they enjoyed for the last time. It was very pleasant to stand and watch my own splendid camels crouched on the ground, eagerly munching the fragrant hay, and see how their big brown eyes shone with placid enjoyment. Our two dogs, Yoldash and Hamra, were, however, of a different opinion. The former, in particular, could not tolerate the camels. He barked at them till he was hoarse, and was visibly well pleased with himself when he could get near enough to snatch a tuft of hair out of one or the other of them. Islam Bai had further engaged two trustworthy men in Yarkand. One, Mohammed Shah, was a grey-beard of 55. He was accustomed to looking after camels, and was the only person who could go near the refractory Nar without being bitten. Although he had left wife and children behind in Yarkand, the desert had no terrors for him. He was a capital fellow, as honest as the day. I could see him now as plainly as though it were only yesterday we parted. His philosophic serenity never deserted him. When the clouds of misfortune gathered thick round our ill-fated caravan, his good humor never failed. There was always a smile on his face. Even when he lay in the delirium of death, a gleam of triumphant serenity shone in his eyes, and the light of an inward peace spread over his withered, copper-brown countenance. The second man who was to help in the management of the camels was Kasim Akhun, a native of Aksu, but at the time an inhabitant of Yarkand, 48 years of age, unmarried, and a caravan leader by profession. Of medium height and strongly built, with a black beard, he was of a serious disposition, and never laughed, though always friendly and pleasant. But he had very often to be reminded of his duties. We wanted yet another man. He was of the same age as Mohammed Shah, and every spring, for 6 years past, had gone a 10 to 14 days' journey into the desert in quest of gold, taking his food on the back of an ass, but not venturing further in than he was able to get water by digging. A few years previously, he had flitted to Merette and now left wife and grown-up children there behind him. His subsequent fate was in part of his own causing. He was brutal and of a violent temper, and the other men, whom he attempted to tyrannize over, soon came to hate him. He conceived that his experience of the desert warranted him in assuming a domineering tone, and he entertained an especial grudge against Islam Bai because Islam was appointed Caravan Bashi, or caravan leader, and the other three men were bidden to obey him. Some of the inhabitants of Merette warned us against this man, telling us that he had been more than once punished for theft, but the warning came too late. When I engaged him, I thought we had lighted upon a treasure trove, for he was the only man in place who knew anything of the desert. Our menagerie of livestock also embraced 3 sheep, which we intended to kill, one after the other, half a score of hens, and a cock, which woke us up in the morning. These last traveled in a basket perched on the top of a camel's load of baggage. The first few days, the hens laid 2 or 3 eggs, but as soon as the water began to fail, they stopped laying. The cock was an eccentric animal. He entertained a rooted objection to riding on a camel's back. Every now and again he used to wriggle through the covering of the basket, and after balancing himself a while on his elevated perch, flew down to the ground with a noisy cackle. Every time we pitched camp, the poultry were let out for a run. They imparted a little life to the otherwise desolate surroundings, and a few handfuls of corn were thrown down amongst the sand to keep them employed and in motion. On April 9th, we made our final preparations. We packed the 2 or 3 bags of bread, which had been ordered beforehand, and filled the 4 iron tanks with fresh water from the river. They held 17.5, 19, and 27 gallons respectively. Add to this 17.5 gallons in a goatskin, and we get a total of 100 gallons. Ample sufficient for a 25 days march. The tanks, which were oblong in shape, were specially made for conveying honey from India to Yarkand, being surrounded by a wooden grating to protect the thin iron plates against damage from knocks. Grass and reeds were packed in between the tank and the grating to prevent the sun's rays from beating directly upon the iron. I reasoned, if from Merette we steered our course eastwards, or rather towards the east-northeast, we were bound sooner or later to come in contact with the Masartag, and like the natives, I was convinced that we should find a lee side to the range, where the drift sand would not be blown together, but we should be able to make long, easy days' marches on firm ground, and possibly might even discover springs and vegetation, and perchance light upon traces of an ancient civilization. On the maps which I had at hand, the distance through the desert, as the crow flies, measured 180 miles, and if we did only 12 miles a day, the entire journey ought not take us more than 15 days. Our supply of water was therefore, by every calculation, more than sufficient. I was quite satisfied with my estimate, and thought we had an easy task before us. As an actual fact, the journey took 26 days, or nearly twice as long as I anticipated. April 10th, long before sunrise, the courtyard was all alive. Our various boxes, bales, and other impedimenta were carried out and weighed so that the camels' burdens might be suitably adjusted, and the several packages properly roped. These preliminaries over, they were placed along the ground 2 by 2, at such distances apart that a camel would just get between them and be made to kneel down whilst his load was fastened to his pack saddle. As he got up on his feet, a big rope was lashed, crisscross, right round the hole and fastened to the horizontal bars in the framework of the pack saddle. We took with us an extensive equipment, provisions for several months, particularly rice and bread, preserved foods, sugar, tea, vegetables, flour, and so forth. In addition, we had a large supply of winter clothing, felts, and carpets, for, after leaving the Khotan Daria, I intended to make for Tibet. Then I had my scientific instruments, photographic apparatus with close upon 1,000 plates, some books, a year's issue of a Swedish journal, of which I proposed reading 1 number every evening, a cooking stove, metal utensils, crockery, 3 rifles, 6 revolvers, a supply of ammunition, packed in 2 heavy boxes, together with a multitude of other things. Add to all this water supplies for 25 days, and it will be clear that each camel had a pretty heavy load to carry. Whilst the animals were being loaded, I measured my first baseline of 400 meters, close upon 1/4 of a mile. Bogra walked it in 5.5 minutes. This was a daily recurring task, for the contours of the ground varied a good deal, and the depth of the sand made a very appreciable difference in the time the camels took to do the same distance. The 10th of April, 1895, was a great day in the annals of Merette. The courtyard, every alley, every house roof in the neighborhood was crowded with people, all anxious to see us off. "They will never come back again, never," we heard them cry to one another. "The camels are too heavily laden. They will never get through the deep sand." These croakings did not disturb me in the least. The ground burned under my feet to get off, and we had an antidote to the ill-omened prophecies in the action of the Hindus who, just as I put my camel in motion, flung a few handfuls of datien, Chinese bronze money with a square hole in the middle, over my head, crying, "Good luck go with you!" The camels were tied together in 2 strings of 4 each. A piece of stick was thrust through the cartilage of the animal's nose. A rope fastened to one end of the stick was loosely knotted to the tail of the camel in front, in such wise that, if the second camel fell, the knot would come undone of itself. The other end of the piece of stick terminated in a knob, which prevented it from slipping out of the animal's nose. I gave my attention wholly and undivided to my compass and watch, by which I steered our course and measured the length of our day's march, and to the observation of the country we were traveling through. Islam Bai had shown much ingenuity in arranging my load for me. It consisted of the 2 boxes which held my most delicate instruments, and such things as I generally needed when we encamped for the night. On the top of the boxes and between the camel's hump, he spread pelts, carpets, and cushions so that with one leg on each side of the front hump, I rode as comfortably as though I were sitting in an easy chair. When all was quite ready, I said goodbye to Niaz Beg, whom I rewarded handsomely, as well as to the missionary Johannes and Hashim. Now, when he saw the caravan ready to start, his courage completely failed him, and for the second time he deserted me in the moment when danger had really to be faced. I despised the fellow. Notwithstanding his pretended piety, he utterly lacked the courage which makes a man place all his reliance upon God. What a strange contrast to Islam Bai, the Mohammedan, the beau ideal of a good and faithful servant, who throughout the days and months that followed never once hesitated to follow his master, no matter where I went, even when I rushed into dangers which prudence should properly have guarded me against. Spring had come. Signs of the change manifested themselves more and more every day. The temperature rose slowly but steadily, the minimum remaining permanently above freezing point. The sun began to have some power. The spring breezes murmured in our ears. The fields were being sown with corn, the rice grounds put under water. The air was alive with the flittings and buzzing of flies and other insects. It was this beautiful Asiatic springtime all about us, the season of perennial hope, that we set out on our journey to the country where all things are gripped in the deathly embrace of 1,000 years' torpor, where every sand dune is a grave, a country whose climate is such that, compared with it, the sternest winter would be a smiling spring. On through the narrow lanes of the town, crowded with people, strode the long string of camels, holding their heads high. It was a solemn moment. Every spectator was impressed. A dead silence reigned throughout the crowd. When my mind goes back to that moment, I am involuntarily reminded of a funeral procession. I can hear the dull, monotonous clang of the caravan bells still ringing in my ears, and of a truth their slow, mournful cadences were the virtual passing bell of most of us who set forth on that eventful day for the sand wastes of the terrible desert, a sad and peaceful grave amid the eternal ocean of sand. Such was to be their melancholy end. The environs of the town were level, the town itself scattered amongst the old poplars, fields, groves, orchards, and irrigation canals. For half an hour or so we marched on quietly through these pleasant surroundings. Then, all of a sudden, there arose a fearful uproar. The 2 youngest camels, being full of spirit, broke loose from their halters, shook off their loads, and frisky as 2 playful puppies, began to race round the fields, till the dust rose in clouds behind them. One had been loaded with a couple of water tanks. Upon being thrown off, one tank sprang a leak, but luckily near the top corner, so that but little real damage was done. The runaways were soon caught, and their burdens lashed on again. After that, each was led separately, for we had plenty of help, fully 100 mounted men accompanying us to the outskirts of the village. An hour later, 2 other camels broke loose. Several things were chafed and bruised, and the ammunition box was trailed on the ground. Muhammad Shah said that camels always get refractory after a spell of rest. They wanted to stretch their limbs, but after a few days' steady tramping, would make them as quiet as lambs. After that, as a precaution, each camel was led by a single man. But even then, as so often happens during the first day or two after starting on an expedition, we had several unforeseen hindrances to contend against. For example, the left side of a camel's load would be heavier than that on the right side, and so had to be adjusted. Or a bag of rice was on the point of slipping off and had to be tied faster, and so on. Skirting the desert. The second day's march passed off more quietly, and in a much more orderly manner. Profiting from our first day's experiences, we weighed and distributed the packages more successfully, and loaded our most precious possessions, the first amongst them, the water, on the quietest camels. I myself sat perched at a pretty good height above the ground, and had a splendid view in every direction. At first, the motion made me feel somewhat giddy, but I soon became accustomed to the monotonous and unceasingly jolting backwards and forwards, combined with the peculiar swaying motion from side to side, and suffered no ill effects from it whatsoever. But I can readily believe it would be very disagreeable to anyone subject to seasickness. Having left behind us the last house and field belonging to Merette, we struck into a level steppe, where thickets and tangled bushes grew pretty well everywhere, and there were even clumps of poplars in a few places. The wind blew in gusts from the west-northwest, and grayish-yellow sandspouts drifted eastwards at a great altitude, their upper ends slightly bent over in the direction of the wind. The surface of the ground was partly covered with fine, soft dust, partly with deposits of salt, but we soon passed into a region of nothing but sand, blown up into small, low dunes or ridges. However, it proved to be only a narrow belt, for on the other side we once more came upon plenteous plant life, chiefly reeds and poplars, and there on the brink of the ravine we pitched our camp for the night. Half an hour later, the loads were all off the camels, and the animals themselves were tied together in a ring to prevent them from lying down and getting stiff-legged. After standing a couple of hours, they were let loose to browse upon the thickets of reeds. Our camp, with its many packages and animals, made a very picturesque appearance, and it gave me a feeling of deep satisfaction to think that all those things were mine. My tent, a neat Indian officer's tent which Mr. McCartney had given me, was pitched underneath a poplar tree. Within it, young Lieutenant Davison had died during his journey across the Pamirs to Kashgar, but it had been well disinfected, and I was not superstitious. The ground inside was covered with a variegated carpet, and all round its sides were ranged my boxes, instrument cases, photographic camera, and my plain, simple bedstead. The other boxes and packages, together with the water tanks, were left outside in the open air. My men kindled a fire and crouched round it to prepare dinner, rice pudding and eggs, for these last we had brought a good supply. The sheep were turned out to graze, and the poultry made themselves quite at home amongst the scraps from the cooking pot. The dogs, having swallowed the pieces of meat that were thrown to them, began to chase one another over the sand dunes. In a word, we made quite a rural picture. As soon as the camp was settled, my first care was to examine the ravine which had stopped us. It ran from north to south, and had undoubtedly been formed by a branch of the Khotan Daria, but was now dry. It was 20 feet wide and 5 feet deep, and when I bade the men dig a hole in the bottom, the water began to trickle up as soon as they got 3 feet 6 inches down. The temperature of the water was 49.8 degrees Fahrenheit, whilst that of the air at the same time, viz. 2 o'clock in the afternoon, was 76.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Although tasting bitter and nauseous, it was greedily drunk by both dogs and sheep. The camels were not allowed any water until nearly an hour before the start next morning. From the very outset, we were obliged to exercise the most rigid economy with our supplies of fresh water, and therefore used the water from the ravine for boiling our eggs in, for washing the dishes, and for personal ablutions. Mohammed Yaqub, who had followed us all the way to the camp, brought us the very welcome present of a couple of copper vessels filled with fresh river water, so that every member of the caravan was able to quench his thirst to the full, without our having to open the water tanks. It had been a warm day, but no sooner did the sun set than we felt it cool and put on our extra coats. In the evening, it was a dead calm. The tent flap was thrown back, but the flame from the candle never quivered. Our desert man gave us a taste of his knowledge. He advised us first to keep for some days to the right bank of the Khotan Daria, till we came to a mountain called Chakmak, and to a large lake which was connected with a river that flowed to the north. To reach that place would take us 18 days, and from there, 1 day more would bring us to the Mazar Tag, the loftiest mountain in all that region. From the Mazar Tag to the Khotan Daria on the east was no great distance. North of Mount Chakmak, there was a track which the gold seekers were accustomed to use, and which led to a signpost. Beyond that mark, the desert was known by the name of Kirk Kishlak, or the 40 Towns, because of the numerous ruins of ancient cities which it contained. April 11th, after a quiet and refreshing night's sleep, I awoke before sunrise and found the weather the reverse of agreeable. A violent nor'easter whistled through the camp, and the air was thick with dust, so that except in the immediate vicinity of the tent, the whole landscape was shrouded in a uniform gray haze. Unloading the baggage and putting up the tent took next to no time at all, but to get everything loaded up again and all started required a good 2 hours, although that included the preparations for breakfast. The camels objected to be loaded, but afterwards, during the remainder of the march, behaved very well. All vegetation gradually ceased, and we lost ourselves in a labyrinth of sand dunes, 15 to 20 feet high, and of irregular formation, though they had for the most part a north-south strike. We tried to skirt round them as much as possible. Still, there were a few difficult ridges which we were compelled to go over. On one or other of these, the camels which carried the water fell. Luckily, it was only the forelegs which gave way in each case, but we could not get the animals up until after we had taken off their loads, and then we had to pack them on again. The camels were very clever at sliding down the sandy slopes, making use of their hind legs as a brake in doing so. In the middle of the day, we got entangled in sand dunes, so high that we were obliged to make a long detour to the north to get out of them. Yolchi asserted that it was no use going east, for we should only be forced to turn back, there being nothing in that direction but big sand. Our route that day was a sinuous line along the edge of the big sand. The dunes dropped again to only 10 feet in height, and occasionally we traveled over soft dust with a tolerably level surface, and not a few times we rode into a kind of cul-de-sac between the horns of the crescent-shaped dunes and were compelled to turn back. Every now and again we passed a few solitary poplars and shriveled reeds, at which the camels snatched as they rolled on past them. The nor'easter blew all day long. The sky was clouded and gray, and it was raw and cold. We halted at dusk, after doing about 13¼ miles, pitched our camp on the top of a hard, level dune, where we had comfortably dry ground under our feet. Close by were some withered poplars from which we obtained fuel for our fire, and clumps of reeds which furnished fodder for the camels. These last were warm after their long tramp and were led about for a time to cool to prevent them from taking cold. We found a spot between two sand dunes where the sand was already damp. There we dug our well and came upon water at a depth of 2½ feet. Its temperature was 49.1 degrees Fahrenheit, and it had the same brackish flavor as the water in the ravine the day before. April 12th, we traveled nearly 15 miles, still along the edge of the great sandy desert, which sent out promontories to the north. Several of these we were obliged to cross over. In other respects, barren desert alternated with narrow belts of steppe, upon which grew scanty tussocks of grass, withered and hard as glass, and which snapped off with a crackling sound at the least touch. The easiest ground to travel over was firm, level sand, but in several places the earth was covered with a coating of dust in which every footmark of the flat-footed camels was sharply outlined. The dust was as soft as wool, and in 2 or 3 places so deep that the animals dropped in it up to their knees. Sometimes a thin crust of salt, which crunched under the camel's hooves, was spread over the horizontal portions of the sand. Solemnly and slowly, the ungainly beasts strode on one after the other, stretching down their long necks to pluck the tussocks of grass which grew within their reach, as though they had premonition of the hard times in store for them. At camp number 3, 2 of the men, as usual, dug a well, but could not get down lower than 6 feet. Still, there was no water. We then left the well to itself for a couple of hours, and the water percolated through and gathered in a little pool at the bottom of the hole. The dogs and poultry were always deeply interested spectators of the digging. They knew perfectly well what it was for, and were always fearfully thirsty. So far, all was going well. Our precious stores were as yet untouched. The stock of camels' provender was likewise undiminished, the animals having to content themselves with reeds and brackish water. The dogs were fed on bread, the poultry on corn and eggshells. The first day, the hens laid 3 eggs, the second day 2, the third 1. However, we had a good supply without that, packed away in chaff in a basket. April 13th. By the morning, there were 7 inches of water in the bottom of the well. All day long, during a march of 12 3/4 miles, we traveled continuously amongst the sand dunes. They were all crescent-shaped, with their convex sides towards the east and the horns or wings and the steeper face looking towards the west or southwest, proving that, at that season of the year, the prevailing winds blew from the east and northeast. Poplar trees were common everywhere throughout the day's march. On some of them, the leaf buds were already beginning to burst, and the fresh green tufts made the camels' mouths water. In most cases, the dunes seemed to shun the poplars, but formed a circular wall around them, leaving the trees in the middle of the hollow. There, too, finding shelter from the wind, dried branches and withered leaves lay in little heaps. It was a warm day. The dogs hunted vainly for water, eagerly running towards every little depression which looked at all like the places in which we dug our desert wells. For lack of better protection from the sun, they lay down in the shade of every poplar we passed, having first scratched away the top layer of hot sand till they came to the stratum that still retains some of the coolness of the night. Islam Bai rode on the first camel, which was also led by Yolchi, our guide. But as Islam commanded the better view, he often corrected Yolchi and suggested taking other directions. That gave umbrage to the ill-natured desert man, so that 2 or 3 times he flung down the rope, threw himself on the sand, and challenged Islam to guide the caravan himself. When we came to camp, a violent quarrel broke out between the 2 men. Yolchi came to my tent and said that if he was to be interfered with by Islam, he had better go back, and he also accused Islam of being close-fisted with the bread. He was considerably taken aback when I quietly remarked, yes, he had better go back, but added that, before he did so, he must repay me the 22 shillings and 6 which he had received and advanced as his first month's wages. That brought him to his senses, and in the most earnest tones he begged to be allowed to remain with me. I allowed him to do so, but on the distinct understanding that henceforward he was to obey Islam. I had my misgivings, however, that when we came face to face, the loneliness and monotony of life in the desert, the differences between the 2 men would break out again. But there were no more quarrels. Although Yolchi nourished a growing spite against Islam, he wisely held his tongue. He always kept himself to himself, never talked to the other men, and slept apart, a little distance from the rest, nor did he ever go near the campfire until after Islam and his comrades had gone to bed. Were they right, I wonder, in suggesting that Yolchi purposely led us in the wrong direction? If so, he paid the penalty, for he died of thirst in the desert. At the depth of 3 3/4 feet, we came upon water, with a temperature of 50.7 degrees Fahrenheit. The dogs were so thirsty that they tried to fling themselves into the hole, and we were obliged to tie them up to prevent them from doing so. On April 14th, Easter Day, we only traveled 11.5 miles. In one place, the dunes on their sheltered side were a steel-gray color. Upon examination, I found that they were coated with a thin crust of mica. I also made the discovery that the green poplars only grew amongst the dunes. Where the dunes came to an end, there the poplars ceased also. Possibly the trees or their roots help in the formation of the dunes. We then came to a belt of desert absolutely barren, the ground being a hard, level plain of a variety of brown colors, crossed by low dunes of yellow sand that looked like logs of wood lying on the earth. Many small pebbles were scattered over the plain. During this day's march, we came across the first traces of the wild camel. At least Yolchi said it was a wild camel, but I was not at all sure of it. Further on, the camel tracks became numerous, but on the other side of the argument, it was not very likely that tame camels would have run away into the desert by themselves. We also observed the droppings and footmarks of horses, and Yolchi swore that the wild horse ranged that part of the desert. On the top of one of these dunes, I halted a moment, in order to observe through my field glass a troop of animals grazing on a bed of reeds a long way off towards the north. But before I could make out whether they were horses or antelopes, they disappeared, going off northwards. The dry, gray clay was built up into small terraces and ridges, so strangely like the gray clay houses in the towns that I could not rest until I went and examined them at close quarters. That day the dogs were very restless, and several times went off a long way from the caravan. Once they were absent a quarter of an hour, and when they came back they were wet underneath. Evidently they had discovered water somewhere. After going about 11.5 miles, we stumbled by chance upon a pool. I bade Kasim try what it tasted like. "Sweet as honey," he replied, after swallowing a good mouthful. The consequence was that we pitched the tent and made our camp by the side of the pool. Men, dogs, sheep, poultry, all hastened to quench their thirst, and as the day had been hot, we were all properly thirsty. The water was as clear as crystal and perfectly sweet, and bubbled up out of a spring, afterwards running into a hollow of the ground some 80 or 90 yards long by about 4 yards wide, so that the water stood at about the same general level below the surface that it did in the wells we had dug. All the same, it was not more than 4 feet down. The temperature was 71.4 degrees Fahrenheit at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. At the same hour, the temperature of the air was 77.9 degrees Fahrenheit. Water spiders and beetles were very numerous. The latter hummed about over the plain, and off went the hens in chase of them. The first of the sheep was slaughtered here with the usual ceremonies, and the dogs got a good meal out of the blood and offal. In a word, considering it was the desert, the place was quite idyllic. The sun disappeared from sight in the dust haze, whilst still 20 degrees above the horizon. Thereupon the heat decreased with marvelous rapidity. By 9 o'clock at night, the temperature of the spring water had fallen to 59.4 degrees Fahrenheit, proving that its temperature varied directly with the temperature of the air. This pleasant camping ground tempted us to give up a day to rest, which was equally welcome to us human beings as to the animals. We all enjoyed a good long sleep, and spent the next day in putting several things in order. The water tanks were filled up, clothes were washed, saddles and straps mended. The day turned out hot, the sand becoming heated to 112.3 degrees Fahrenheit. But 2 or 3 whirlwinds came up out of the north-northeast and cooled the air splendidly. Whilst, without any reproach of conscience, we could drink as much water as we ever liked. As for the camels and dogs, they drank so much that you could actually see their skins swelling out. The rest also suited the hens. They managed to lay 4 eggs. During the night, the dogs barked incessantly and kept running back along the route by which we had come, and on which we had seen the tracks of the wild camels. No doubt the denizens of the desert were accustomed to frequent the springs during the night, but finding us in possession of the place, they kept themselves at a safe distance for that night. On April 16th, we did 16 3/4 miles through a country where sand dunes 15 or 16 feet high alternated with steps of withered reeds which crunched under the camels' feet and sent up clouds of dust when trodden upon. Tamarisks and poplars occurred in sporadic clumps. We passed 2 pools of water, like the one we had left in the morning. All 3 lay along the same line, stretching east-northeast. In all probability, they mark the course of a different affluent of the Khotan Daria. We put out further and further into the unknown ocean of sandy desert. Not a sign of life to be seen, not a sound to be heard, except the monotonous ding-dong of the bells tinkling in time to the soft tramping of the camels. Every now and again we made a short halt, whenever in fact we were at all uncertain of the course we ought to steer, opportunities which the men seized upon to eat their simple breakfast, consisting of a few handfuls of toasted flour, steeped in water, which they supped out of wooden bowls. The water in the tanks became tepid during the course of the day. For my own part, I always missed out breakfast and contented myself with 2 meals a day. April 17th. Today there was a fresh westerly breeze, but the sky remained perfectly clear. On several occasions I noticed that the dust storms were only raised by the easterly and northeasterly winds, whilst no matter how strongly it blew from the west, the sky always remained pure and clear. Before we had gone very far, we perceived in the north a tolerably high mountain, like a cloud or slight thickening of the atmosphere fringing the horizon. Hour after hour we rode towards it, but the mountain grew no plainer to the eye, nor did we seem to approach any nearer to it. The dunes reached 16 feet in height, and were often very difficult to get over. Between them, the reed steps became more frequent, and the reeds ranker in growth. A few hares leapt out from amongst them as the caravan drew near. This day, too, we passed some small pools, but they were surrounded by saline incrustations, and the water in them was brackish. Away towards the east-northeast, a former river had cut its sinuous way through the desert. The channel, which was half choked with sand and contained only a few disconnected pools of water, was 45 yards wide and 6.5 feet deep. Another riverbed, quite dry, was 22 yards wide. Yolchi's explanation was as follows. The mountains we saw were the southeastern continuation of the Mazar Tag, stretching down to the right or southern bank of the Khotan Daria. The 2 dried-up riverbeds had been affluents of the Khotan Daria, which used to receive a portion of their waters during the height of the summer. The clouds we saw in the north were columns of steam or evaporation from the Khotan Daria, reflected upon the pure blue sky. In all these explanations he was unquestionably right. At a later period I was able to test 2 or 3 of his statements and found things to be exactly as he said. For a whole hour we traveled between 2 parallel ridges of sand, which stretched north by 15 degrees east. The one on our right was more than 30 feet high, and both had rounded outlines. The level steppe between them was overgrown with exuberant thistles and poplars. We crossed the ridge on our right, and then passed along a second valley, running parallel to the first. At the end of 17.5 miles, we pitched camp number 7. Under the shade of a couple of leafy poplars. We had no need to dig for water. There were several indications that a lake or running stream could not be far off. North of us was a thick forest of poplars. Mosquitoes, flies, and moths were abundant. At night, the last mentioned fluttered round my candle in hundreds. Okay, we'll put the bookmark in here. Next episode, we'll pick up where we left off and get to the part where things take a disastrous turn, and men and animals start perishing in the hot desert. Please consider coming back for more Sven Hedin in the Taklamakan Desert. Until then, this is your host and friendly narrator, Laszlo Montgomery, signing off from the low desert of Southern California, not too distant from the Mojave. I'm not planning any Sven Hedin-type expeditions in the near or distant future, though I may take a ride to Death Valley before the summer hits. We'll see. See you next time, everybody.